Hi, chickens. Guess what's happening now? I'm reading you the last chapter of the novel, chapter 23. It's 12 pages, starts on 276. I'm going to post the questions, and they won't be due until. Wait, do we have class tomorrow? Uh, yeah. Just try to get them done by Friday morning. We're not supposed to give any work on Friday. Hooray! So it's Flexi Friday. Gives you a chance to catch up. If you want to do work over the weekend, you're really bored, I'm going to post the chapter summaries that I haven't done yet for 18 through 20, 21 through 23. And then I'll compile a study guide that's going to help you guys study for your test next week. But guess what? You're going to have a whole day to do the test. Like a whole day and a whole night with the notes. So, cool. And then we're going to start our essays, okay? Well, I'm going to give you like a whole lesson. I'm going to try to learn how to use Screencastify, and I'm going to show you the whole picture, okay? All right, here comes the book. Page, whoop, it was upside down. 276. Last chapter. Nothing seemed to change much in the week or so after that trip. I didn't expect it to stay that way, though, and sure enough, by the start of October, I started noticing little differences. Here it gets sad. For one thing, though Tommy carried on with his animal pictures, he became cagey about doing them in my presence. We weren't quite back to how it was when I'd first become his carer, and all the cottages stuff was still hanging over us. But it was like he'd thought about it and come to a decision that he'd continue with the animals as the mood took him, but if I came in, he'd stop and put them away. I wasn't that hurt by this. In fact, in many ways it was a relief. Those animals staring at us in the face when we were together would have only made things more awkward. But there were other changes I found less easy. I don't mean we weren't still having some good times up in his room. I'm not going to read the next sentence. But what I couldn't help noticing was more and more Tommy tended to identify himself with the other donors at the center. If, for instance, the two of us were reminiscing about old Hailsham people, he'd sooner or later move the conversation round to one of his current donor friends who'd maybe said or done something similar to what we were recalling. There was one time in particular when I drove into the Kingsfield after a long journey and stepped out of the car. The square was looking a bit like that time I'd come to the center with Ruth the day we'd gone to see the boat. It was an overcast autumn afternoon, and there was no one about except for a group of donors clustered under the overhanging roof of the recreation building. I saw Tommy was with them. He was standing with his shoulder against a post and was leaning to a donor who was sitting crouched on the entrance steps. I came towards them a little way, then stopped and waited there in the open under the gray sky. But Tommy, though he'd seen me, went on listening to his friend, and eventually he and all the others burst out laughing. Even then, he carried on listening and smiling. He claimed afterwards that he'd signaled to me to come over, but if he had, it hadn't been at all obvious. All I registered was him smiling vaguely in my direction, then going back to what his friend was saying. Okay, he was in the middle of something, and after a minute or so he did come away, and the two of us went up to his room. But it was quite different to the way things would have happened before, and it wasn't just that he'd kept me waiting out in the square. I wouldn't have minded that so much. It was more that I sensed for the first time that day something close to resentment on his part at having to come away with me. And once we were up in his room, the atmosphere between us wasn't so great. To be fair, a lot of it might have been down to me as much as to him, because as I stood there watching them, all talking and laughing, I'd felt an unexpected little tug. Because there was something about the way these donors had arranged themselves in a rough semicircle, something about their poses, almost studiedly relaxed, whether standing or sitting, as though to announce to the world how much each one of them was savoring the company, that reminded me of the way our little gang used to sit around our pavilion together. Oh, Kathy's feeling left out. That comparison, as I say, tugged something inside me, and so maybe, once we were up in his room, it was as much me feeling resentful as the other way around. I'd feel a similar little prickler Oh, that's a tongue twister. I'd feel a similar little prickle of resentment each time he told me I didn't understand something or other because I wasn't yet a donor. But apart from one particular time, which I'll come to in a moment, a little prickle was all it was. Usually he'd say these things to me half jokingly, almost affectionately, and even when there was something more to it, like the time he told me to stop taking his dirty washing to the laundry because he could do it himself, it hardly amounted to a row. Remember, a row is a fight. That time I'd asked him, "What difference does it make which one of us takes the towels down? I'm going that way anyway." To which he'd shaken his head and said, "Look, Kath, I'll sort out my own things. If you were a donor, you'd see." Okay, it did niggle. But it was something I could forget easily enough. But, as I say, there was this one time he brought it up about my not being a donor that really riled me. It happened about a week after the notice came for his fourth donation. We'd been expecting it and had already talked through it a lot. In fact, we'd had some of our most intimate conversations since the Littlehampton trip, discussing the fourth donation. I've known donors to react in all sorts of ways to their fourth donation. Some want to talk about it all the time, endlessly and pointlessly. Others will only joke about it, while others refuse to discuss it at all. And then there's this odd tendency among donors to treat a fourth donation as something worthy of congratulations. A donor on a fourth. Even one who's been pretty unpopular up until then is treated with a special respect. Even the doctors and nurses play up to this. A donor with a fourth will go on for a check and will be greeted by white coats smiling and shaking their hand. Well, Tommy and we talked about all of this, sometimes jokingly, other times seriously and carefully. We discussed all the different ways people tried to handle it and which ways made the best sense. Once, lying side by side on the bed with the dark coming on, he said, "You know why it is, Kath? Why everyone worries so much about the fourth? It's because they're not sure they'll really complete. If you knew for certain you'd complete, it would be easier. But they never tell us for sure." I'd been wondering for a while if this would come up, and I'd been thinking about how I'd respond, but when it did, I couldn't find much to say, so I just said, "It's just a lot of rubbish, Tommy. Just talk. Wild talk. It's not even worth thinking about." But Tommy would have known I had nothing to back up my words. He'd have known, too, he was raising questions to which even the doctors had no answers. You'll all have heard the same talk. How many after the fourth donation, even if you're technically completed, you're still conscious in some sort of way. How then you find there are more donations, plenty of them, on the other side of that line. How there are no more recovery centers, no carers, no friends. How there's nothing to do except watch your remaining donations until they switch you off. Ooh, that's pretty bad. It's horror movie stuff, and most of the time people don't want to think about it. Guys, that's another thing to refer to in your papers. It's on page 279. How even after clones have completed, and even if they're like in a half-conscious state, their organs still might be removed. Now, some of you on your license, you've agreed to be like an organ donor. I've done that because I just figure, okay, fine, why not, help others in need. But these are like people that were alive and died for giving their organs, and then they're still being given their organs. It's kind of creepy. So she says it's horror movie stuff, and most of the time people don't even want to think about it. Not the white coats, not the carers, and usually not the donors. But now and again, a donor will bring it up, as Tommy did that evening, and I wish now we'd talked about it. As it was, after I dismissed it as rubbish, we both shrank back from the whole territory. At least, though, I knew it was on Tommy's mind after that, and I was glad he'd at least confided in me that far. What I'm saying is, all in all, I was under the impression we were dealing with the fourth donation pretty well together, and that's why I was so knocked off balance by what he came out with that day we walked around the field. The King's Field doesn't have much in the way of the grounds. The square's obvious congregating point and the few bits behind the buildings look more like wasteland. The largest chunk, which the donors call the field, is a rectangle of overgrown weeds and thistles held in by wire mesh fences. There's always been talk of turning it into a proper lawn for the donors, but they haven't done it yet even now. It might not be so peaceful then if they did get around to it because of the big road nearby. All the same, when donors get restless and need to walk it off, that's where they tend to go, scraping through all the needles and the brambles. The particular morning I'm talking about, it was really foggy, and I knew the field would be soaking, but Tommy had been insistent that we go there for a walk. Not surprisingly, we were the only ones there, which probably suited Tommy just fine. After crashing about the thickets for a few minutes, he stopped next to the fence and stared at the blank fog on the other side, and then he said, "Kath, I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but I've been thinking it over, Kath. I think I ought to get a different carer." Ouch. In the few seconds after he said this, I realized I wasn't surprised by it at all, that in some funny way I'd been waiting for it. But I was angry all the same, and I just didn't say anything. In the few seconds after he said this, I realized... Oh, sorry, I already read that. It's not just because the 4th donation's coming up. It's because of stuff like what happened last week when I had all this kidney trouble. There's going to be much more stuff like that coming. Well, that's why I came and found you. That's exactly why I came to help you. For what's starting now, and that's what Ruth wanted too. Ruth wanted that other thing for us, Tommy said. She wouldn't necessarily have wanted you to be my carer through this last bit. Tommy, I said, and I suppose by now I was furious, but I kept my voice quiet and under control. I'm the one to help you. That's why I came and found you again. Ruth wanted the other thing for us, Tommy repeated. All this is something else. Kath, I don't want to be that way in front of you. He was looking down at the ground, a palm pressed against the wire mesh fence, and for a moment he looked like he was listening intently to the sound of the traffic somewhere beyond the fog. And that was when he said it, shaking his head slightly. Ruth would have understood. She was a donor, so she would have understood. I'm not saying she'd necessarily have wanted the same thing for herself. If she'd been able to, maybe she'd have wanted you as her carer right to the end, but she'd have understood about me wanting to do it differently, Kath. Sometimes you just don't see it. You don't see it because you're not a donor. It was when he came out with this that I turned and walked off. Sorry, my cat's trying to walk onto the computer. Oh boy, now I lost my place. Okay, yeah. It was when he came out with that I turned and walked off. As I'd said, I'd been almost prepared for the bit about not wanting me anymore as his carer, but what had really stung... Here we go back to the Ruth thing. Coming after all those other little things. Like when he'd kept me standing in the square, was what he'd said then, the way he divided me off yet again, not just from all the other owners, but from him and Ruth. This never turned into a huge fight, though. When I stalked off, there wasn't much else I could do other than go back to his room, and then he came up himself several minutes later. I'd cooled down by then, and so had he, and we were able to have a better conversation about it. It was a bit stiff, but we made peace, and even got into some of the practicalities of changing carers. Then, as we were sitting in the dull light side by side on the edge of his bed, he said to me, I don't want us to fight again, Kath, but I've been wanting to ask you this a lot. I mean, don't you get tired of being a carer? All the rest of us, we became donors ages ago. We've been doing it for years. Don't you wish sometimes, Kath, that they'd hurry up and send you your notice? I shrugged. I don't mind. Anyway, it's important there are good carers, and I'm a good carer. What? Is it really that important? Okay, it's really nice to have a good carer, but in the end, is it really so important? The donors will all donate, just the same, and then they'll complete. Of course it's important. A good carer makes a difference to what a donor's life is actually like. Whoa, I just saw a connection there, guys. It's like teaching. So people could say, ugh, the teaching profession. What do you teach those kids about? They don't care about anything. You don't get paid anything. Why are you in this job? Right? He's saying, like, what's the point of being a carer when you're gonna die anyway? Well, you could say that about any job. Like, what's the point of putting in any effort to anything because we're all gonna die? But, she's saying, but being a good carer, being a good teacher, being a good student makes a difference, right? Okay, now where was I? Oh, yeah. But all this rushing about you do, all this getting exhausted and being by yourself, I've been watching you, it's wearing you out. You must do, Kath. You must sometimes wish they'd tell you you can stop. I don't know why you don't have a word with them. Ask them why it's been so long. Then when I kept quiet, he said, I'm just saying, that's all. Let's not fight again. I put my head on his shoulder and said, yeah, well, maybe it won't be for much longer anyway. But for now, I have to keep going. Even if you don't want me around, there are others who do. I suppose you're right, Kath. You are a really good carer. You'd be the perfect one for me, too, if you weren't you. He did a laugh and put his arm around me, though we kept sitting side by side. Then he said, I keep thinking about this river somewhere with the water moving really fast and these two people in the water trying to hold on to each other. This is really important, guys. This is an analogy again. And these two people are in the water, trying to hold on to each other, holding on as hard as they can. But in the end, it's just too much. The current's too strong. They've got to let go, drift apart. That's how I think it is with us. It's a shame, Kath, because we've loved each other all our lives. But in the end, we can't stay together forever. And that's kind of how life is too. Because sometimes you lose the loved ones that are closest to you. And that's just sometimes it happens. So I'm just going to read that one more time. That whole analogy, I think it's a beautiful part of the book. Tommy says, I keep thinking about this river somewhere with the water moving really fast. And these two people in the water trying to hold on to each other, holding on as hard as they can. But in the end, it's just too much. The current's too strong. They've got to let it go and drift apart. That's how I think it is with us. It's a shame, Kath, because we've loved each other all our lives, but in the end, we can't stay together. Okay, it's like 4 pages left. Almost there. I might need to have a dinner break and then I'll finish, but let me just finish this one part. When he said this, I remembered the way I'd held on to him that night in the wind-swept field on the way back from Littlehampton. I don't know if he was thinking about that too, or if he was still thinking about his rivers and strong currents. In any case, we went on sitting like that, on the side of the bed for a long time, lost in our thoughts. Then in the end I said to him, I'm sorry I blew up at you earlier. I'll talk to them. I'll try and see to it that you get someone really good. It's a shame, Kath, he said again, and I don't think we talked about it anymore that morning. Okay, so stay tuned for part 2.